Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, an obsessive reader and used book collector, and I am in desperate need of a haircut. Today we're talking my October book haul. These books. I actually picked these up at the end of September, but that was about a week after I released my first monthly book haul video for September, so I didn't want to record one right away, so that's why we're doing this now. And if I sound kind of hoarse today, that's because I'm just coming out of having a sore throat for the last few days, which is why this video is probably late as well, but I'm gonna try to push through it. So let's get started. So if you watched my first book haul video, you know that I got into the hobby of collecting used books last year when I went to this small town about 2 hours from where I live and went to 2 used bookstores there that were really small and really good. And that kind of kicked me off on this hobby that I've been going through for the last year. So a few weeks ago, I went back to that town and visited both stores and I did a pickup. I've been on the lookout for a lot of classic sci-fi. This is something I'm trying to push myself to get into a bit more. I talked about this a lot in my newbie tag and a few other videos, but I'm really looking out for some classic sci-fi. So when spooky season is over and I'm a bit further along in the Dresden Files, I'm gonna finally make that move to start reading a bunch of the classic sci-fi I picked up. And all of the books except for one in this haul are classic sci-fi. So we might as well start with talking about that book, the one that isn't classic sci-fi. And this is one that actually popped up on my top 10 horror books that I'm dying to read, the video I put out a couple weeks ago, and that is Misery by Stephen King. In that video, I explained that this is one of the gaps I have in Stephen King. I've read a lot of his work, but Misery is one that I didn't necessarily have the drive to read for a while because I knew the story so well from the movie. So I wasn't necessarily, super into getting into the book. This is one I thought about reading this October for spooky season, but in thinking about it, I like to read books in the season that they either take place or when it matches the vibe of what's going on outside. So in October, I like to read horror books. In the summer, I like to read fantasy. And in the cold months, I like to read dark mystery detective stuff. So I thought that since this book takes place in the winter, in the cold, isolated in a cabin, I would, instead of reading it in October, save it for the winter when the vibe of the story matched the vibe of outside. I also don't mind taking a bit of a break from Stephen King, considering this summer I finished the Dark Tower series, and that was a huge undertaking and took the whole summer for me to read from books 2 to 7 all the way through. I've read a couple of his short stories since then, specifically the ones that relate to the Dark Tower, but I'm maybe on a King hiatus for the time being because I'm a bit still on that hangover of having finished the Dark Tower. Next we have On the Beach by Neville Shute. This is one that's been on my TBR for a while, actually. It's one that you hear often referred to or talked about in classic sci-fi or classic post-apocalyptic fiction. I don't know much about the story except in that it takes place maybe after a nuclear apocalypse and is about a small community trying to survive after that apocalypse. I don't know much about it except that and its legendary classic status. I have heard that, it doesn't hold up super well. It's not the greatest or most engaging stories, especially considering how much post-apocalyptic fiction has come out since then. I believe the book came out in the 50s, so there's certainly been a lot of time for post-apocalyptic fiction to grow as a genre and to maybe become more subtle and nuanced, but nonetheless, I'm still excited to read this, especially as it is a classic of that genre. Next up, we have The Diamond Age by Neal Stephenson. This was one that actually wasn't on my TBR at all, but in finding out that my local library had a copy and then seeing it for super cheap at the used bookstore, I figured might as well pick it up. I've had another book by this author on my TBR for a while, which is Snow Crash. I'm a big fan of the cyberpunk genre and love Neuromancer and wanted to expand my reading in that genre as well. So I added Snow Crash and it's been there for a while. I just haven't found it at any used bookstore, so I haven't read it yet, but I think I'll read Snow Crash first before getting into this one. I don't know much about this one either, but I know that Neal Stephenson is more of kind of a postmodern cyberpunk writer rather than a straightforward kind of earnest one. So maybe I'll read a bit more of the straightforward ones, like continuing the Sprawl trilogy by William Gibson, maybe some of his other works before getting into Neal Stephenson. I do also own Cryptonomicon by the same author. I haven't read it. I think I read the first few chapters just to get a sense of what it's about, and it seems really weird and unusual, but in a good way. It was recommended to me by somebody I used to work with, and it seems like a very daunting, big, all over the place book, but that's the one I'll probably get to last after having read Snow Crash and The Diamond Age. Next we have Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. I'm a big fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie, and in going in and reading the book following that, I was super impressed by the way the book naturally kind of unfolded things to you in a way that the movie intentionally didn't really explain to you or left up to your interpretation. And Arthur C. Clarke really impressed me with that work, and I loved it, especially as a supplement to one of my favorite movies. So I thought, okay, I'd look out for more of his works and find out which of his other books are also classics or the ones that you kind of have to read if you're a fan of 2001. And Rendezvous with Rama was on that list. So this one has a very intriguing concept, and I think similarly to 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's about a first contact where there's this giant object that's discovered to be a spaceship that enters our solar system, and people on Earth are kind of freaking out and wondering what it's going to be like when they actually meet with this object or if it arrives at Earth. And I thought that was a really intriguing hook, and so I added that to my TBR a long while ago. And this is one I had a lot of trouble finding at used bookstores despite being a very famous book. I must have seen Rama 2 in every instance I've gone to a used bookstore, but never Rendezvous with Rama. And in this past adventure to a used bookstore, I found it and I thought, great, finally. You know, it took me so long to find, and thankfully it's not Rama 2. And then I went to the second bookstore in that town and they also had it, but in a different cover. I only picked up this first one here because, you know, there's a line I'll draw with my used book collecting. I'll do some silly things with collecting books, but I don't need 2 copies of the same one, especially in the same visit to the stores. So between this story and Imperial Earth, I'm really excited to get into the works of Arthur C. Clarke beyond 2001: A Space Odyssey. Next we have A Medicine for Melancholy by Ray Bradbury. So this is another one I can add to the list of ever-growing Ray Bradbury short story collections that I have on my bookshelf. So far I've read The Illustrated Man and a handful of short stories from this collection I have, which I believe is just called Bradbury Stories. It has 100 of his short stories in there collected from a bunch of his works. But of the short stories I've read, I've really liked what he's written, and every time I see one of these short story collections, I realize that he has more and more out there, and I say, okay, I need this one, I need this one. And the reason why it's taken me a while to get through his short story collections, and this goes for other ones as well, is I don't like to read them all the way through like a novel. I like to read a couple short stories at a time, maybe. I find that it's the same as binging TV shows. I don't really do that. I like to process and kind of try to understand and think critically about the things that I watch, so I don't like to watch too much at one time because it gets all muddled in my head and I can't really think about it as well. So with short stories, I like to process them one at a time over the course of months or years. Like in the instance of the H.P. Lovecraft collection I have, it's taken me over 3 years to nearly finally complete that because I just want to process things at a natural pace and kind of take each story as its own rather than part of a bunch of other stuff. I'm not sure what the theme is for this one. I know some of the Bradbury collections I have a specific kind of theme or arc to them where it makes sense for those stories to be in the same collection. So I'm curious to see what the theme is in this one. I think it has to do something with melancholy, I suppose. Maybe some emotions. We'll see. And if you're asking, no, I still haven't read Fahrenheit 451, but I promise I'm gonna do it sometime soon. Maybe before the end of the year. We'll see how my reading is going. Next, we have Ringworld by Larry Niven. This is another one that shows up a lot on lists of essential sci-fi you have to read, and it's another one that has a very intriguing concept. I have heard that Larry Niven maybe isn't the best writer and that a lot of his stories don't really hold up as well in terms of quality, but I'm curious nonetheless to read this story and figure out what maybe a bit of the hype is about, or lack of hype in today's age. I have also bought a couple of his other works. I have Inferno, which I think is more a bit fantasy, and it was co-written with Jerry Pournelle, as well as another one written with Jerry Pournelle, which is The Mote in God's Eye. So when I do take that deep dive into classic sci-fi, I think I'm gonna start with Ringworld. It's one of his solo works, so maybe it'll be a bit more of an entry point for me into what he's all about versus starting with a book that he co-wrote with someone else. And I think this book is one that takes place in his known space universe, which is the name given to, I think, the stories that are part of his shared world that he's created. I know there's also a short story collection that takes place in this shared universe, but maybe Ringworld will be a good entry point. I do sometimes, when getting into a new writer, like to read their short stories first to get a little taste of their style and see if this is something I want to commit to with their longer works. But since I already have Ringworld on hand and it seems like a pretty short novel anyway, maybe that'll be my first entry point into Larry Niven. And lastly, we have The Pass Through Tomorrow and Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein. So these I thought I'd just cover together since they're by the same author and have similar themes. These two specifically came up a lot when I was looking into books to read with regards to classic sci-fi. The Pass Through Tomorrow is a short story collection, and a lot of people say it's a good entry point into his works, while Stranger in a Strange Land may also be a good entry point just because it's a shorter work and serves as a good introduction to maybe some of his ideas or sci-fi concepts. I think I'll start with The Pass Through Tomorrow first, just so I can get a taste of what he's kind of written and his style because they're short stories. But these are ones, despite being so popular, I also had trouble finding. I know the retail copy of Stranger in a Strange Land is super cheap and wouldn't have cost me a lot to just pick it up from the store, but I held out for it and I'm happy I did. And The Pass Through Tomorrow is a book I couldn't find anywhere, especially online. The retailer where I live doesn't carry it. A lot of the used book sites that I like to go on to didn't have it either. And I thought that maybe it was out of print, and this is one that I'll just kind of have to skip because it's going to be too hard to find, but I'm happy I did find it. So that's it for my October book haul. I know there wasn't a lot of spooky stories on here to talk about during spooky season, but I did pick these up in September, so it doesn't really count. Maybe for next month, I'll try to find some spooky stories. In a couple weekends, I'm going to be going to a used bookstore about half an hour from where I live that I haven't been to yet, so that'll be exciting, and I'll try to look for some spooky stories to make up for this round. I like to do these about once a month to kind of rein in my spending. I spent way too much money on books in the summer before I started this channel, so I'm trying to commit to a budget and stay with that and limiting myself to go on one of these hauls just once a month. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about today in my book haul, and if you did read them, did you like them? And if you've seen what I picked up here, let me know if you have any further recommendations for some of these authors, because I'm, super willing to get into some more classic sci-fi. Remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.